conception of common currency as depicted by the government bench. A common currency is not just a collection of states that are near each other, foolishly entering into joining a union without any economic similarity. On our side of the house, we don't have to support every common currency area, but we do think that the good ones are worthwhile, and good currency areas typically feature similar economies first and foremost. For example, the West African franc has ECOWAS, which is a coalition of states with similar levels of development and economic size. They feature convergence criteria. So, for example, if you're part of the European Union, you can't have an interest rate above a certain rate. You can't have a certain deficit to GDP ratio above a certain level, so that you have some form of economic similarity and that your monetary policy should generally be similar. And thirdly, there is a democratic process of deciding monetary policy. For example, Second Gov wants to talk about how the euro is so undemocratic, but we have one member of each state in the European Council, and we think that that's a perfectly democratic way of deciding economic policy. Under this form, a coalition of states making monetary decisions together, we are very happy to support common currency as a viable economic solution for two reasons. First, because it fosters international trade, and second, because it encourages responsible economic governance. But before I start that, I want to go into 3 points of rebuttal. Most of it's going to be interwoven in my case. Okay, so Second Gov's main case is that common currencies are undemocratic. I'm going to talk about that a lot in my second point, but considering the economic impact of a policy lasts far longer than a standard political term, do you think that Janet Yellen should be elected? Probably not. They have their example of the housing crisis and manipulating interest rates, but we actually think that helps us because politicians will manipulate the interest rate in order to get out of a housing crisis quickly, but then affect, say, investment in the long term with long-term economic repercussions. Second of all, they say that this causes the rise of the far right. This is factually incorrect. Numerous studies show that this is mostly due to racism, Islamophobia, and migration policy in Europe, rather than economic causes, since the far right has been around since the 1970s, way before the euro. And then finally, they say that Greece should print the drachma. At the point in which Gov is encouraging hyperinflation, which then makes debt harder to pay off because that debt becomes more expensive, I think they have already lost this round. Okay, so going into my substantive point. First, it fosters international trade. So prior to the signing of the Maastricht Treaty in 1991, Europe was losing market share in the global commodities market and becoming a net importer, right? This is because a natural occurrence, because Europe was a developed economy with a strong labor standards in terms of regulations and highly skilled, well-educated workers. And because these workers were so skilled, they had a high wage rate. And the costs of manufacturing were similarly high because they had good labor practices. These aren't things we want to get rid of on our side of the house, like paying workers fairly and making sure they work in safe conditions. This caused deindustrialization, where manufacturing was leaving Europe for the developing world. This caused a loss of jobs, high unemployment rates, economic stagnation, and income inequality, where there was a widening gap between people who used to have jobs in manufacturing and now did not, and then the capitalists who are investing in tech and service-based economies, right? Now, enter the European Union. I'll take you at this end of the point. Before the euro, trading between, for example, two countries like Austria and Germany was almost as expensive as trading between Austria and Brazil because of exchange rates, protectionism, and dissimilar regulations that all increased the cost of business, right? So it makes the cost of doing international business uncertain, and it also causes things like taxes and tariffs to be levied between nations. When the Eurozone is formed, and trade within European states skyrocketed because states were suddenly able to trade with each other. They had similar regulations. They didn't have to deal with the uncertainty of an exchange market where your product will be worth less one day than the next. And we think that that really helped bring trade back to Europe because, first of all, intra-Europe trade could increase dramatically. For example, the case of Austria. Gov says that you lose internal trade. This is categorically false. Austria's trade skyrocketed 300% within 3 years of joining the euro. Okay, so it also does the same for external trade, though, really importantly. Nations can trade more with the outside world because it allows them to form a bloc to negotiate trade deals, as well as to be more competitive internationally since they have that basis for manufacturing. So before, a state like Austria wouldn't necessarily be able to sign a trade deal with a country like India because Austria is pretty small in comparison to India, and India has a lot of trade deals with a lot of people that want to enter a deal with them. But now, when it's the European Union as a whole signing a trade deal, there are much more viable negotiating partner, and more countries want to do business with them. We think that this is really important on our side of the house, and it's unique to common currency areas because they can enter an agreement like a bloc that's going to have similar monetary policy, that's going to have, most importantly, in terms of any trade deal, the same exchange rate in the long term. So what does more international trade mean as an impact? It means that less jobs are lost overall. You see more manufacturing jobs stay in Europe rather than going to the developing world because European manufacturers will be able to produce their goods for other European countries without losing standards of labor and entering a race to the bottom. You see that you're going to have more competitiveness and more ability for labor to empower itself because instead of fighting against, say, that race to the bottom with, say, factory workers in Bangladesh, they're competing with each other and they can form better unions and better collective bargaining. We also think there's just more products available to people and you have a higher standard of living as a result. And on their side of the house, you're going to see a declining share of in the world economy for OECD countries. And also, if you're not talking about the OECD, if you're talking for example, about Latin America, we think that my partner brought up an excellent point where developing countries are going to feel forced to enter something like dollarization because they can't support themselves and then they have no say in the process whatsoever. Okay, on to my second point about how this encourages responsible economic governments. Recognize that while government depicts the loss of monetary policy as a net destabilizer, we think that while it may create a difficult adjustment period immediately following a financial crisis, it is a net benefit for nations for three key reasons. First, nations have to report national economic data to international bodies, which encourages transparency. Right? When you have transparency in what's happening in your economy, you're going to have less corruption for governments, which is particularly important, for example, in West Africa with the West African franc, and you're going to have more informed voters. Second, nations are going to have, as I said earlier, a set of convergence criteria to adhere to, like, for example, the 70% deficit to GDP ratio in the Eurozone, which means you can't have politicians creating unsustainable long-term policies to benefit themselves and benefit re-election in the short term. So you're going to have less politicians selling out the people to just keep their jobs. Third, you have short-term economic solutions for you have the decreased ability of one government to engage in currency manipulation, and First Gov talked about why that's so great. So for all these reasons, we are very, very, very proud to oppose.